This presentation is going to be as much about what's changed as about what we currently know. So this was done by partners. This is partners across Greater Manchester. So 10GM is a little joint venture, you might have heard me mention before, of all the different local infrastructure organisations. And we commissioned between us, and nobody was funded to do this, we all chipped in a little bit to make it happen. Sheffield Hallam University, who did the 2013 report, to produce us a new version. So, first off, how many organisations? That's the number that's still burned into my brain from 2013. Higher or lower? Higher? Higher? Is everybody going with higher? Yeah. Well, no surprises there. It's gone up. 3,394. These should have sort of little zingy, catchy numbers and flashes and theme music on. But of course, that only makes sense if you look behind it, and this is where some of the data tells us. So we split the sector into sizes of organisation. Obviously there are loads of different ways of doing this, but this is one that's quite useful to tell you about where the pressures are in the sector. Interestingly, if you ever see any of the national stuff about our sector, small is under 1 million. That's the national definition. So we're talking very much local data here. So when I say small, I mean tiny. I mean, absolutely, a few people organise something in a particular part of the city with money for tea and coffee or the washing powder for the football kits. What do you think? Higher or lower for the micros? Higher. Higher? Yep. Yep. Quite a big increase there. What that shows, I think, is a lot more people wanting to set something up and do something. Next one's lower though. So that threshold of groups where perhaps you've got maybe 1 or 2 part-time members of staff and some volunteers all working together, that number of organisations seems to be going down. Obviously there's a bit of, the data and this and who we got responses from and everything, but we try to balance it out as much as possible. But I think that's, even so, the fact that that's decreased slightly is an issue. Other important thing is obviously who do they work with? As you would imagine, by far the biggest group is those who say yes, we work with everybody, and we do try to dig a bit behind that, but most of our organisations, given what they do, that is probably quite true. The numbers of groups who say everyone has actually dropped slightly, and I think there's some interesting things behind that, because if you look at some of the changes are quite alarming in this. So organisations saying they support everybody has dropped, but actually, if children and families is fairly consistent, there's always a huge chunk of the sector, so about a quarter on this. Older people, that's really, really worrying given that we have an ageing population, that our sector's focus has gone from 1/5 of the sector focused almost mainly on older people down to less than 10%. That's worrying. Perhaps even more worrying is the fact that we've lost, apparently, a lot of focus on BME communities, so from 20 down to 16. Now my guess is that some of that stuff about small and medium-sized organisations is that more organisations are struggling if they've been focused on a particular community because it's harder to get funding for. And obviously some of this is about what's popular in funding terms, it's what's a priority at the moment. The community cohesion stuff, which many BME groups used to get funded through, has fallen off the agenda until very, very recently, so I suspect that's part of it as well. Mental health staying fairly stable. Again, women's organisations dropped. It always surprises me that Manchester isn't stronger in terms of the women's sector, particularly given this city's history. So I suspect what's happening is our sector is spreading itself out more widely. So it doesn't necessarily mean, this is numbers of organisations, remember, it doesn't necessarily mean that the amount of work that's going on is as stark as that. I suspect it's more that organisations are specialising and saying, well, either we work with everybody or we work with some particular communities, because that's basically where the opportunity is, where the funding opportunity is. Main areas of work, so Top one is always community development. Most things have stayed fairly stable, but community work and health and well-being work have gone up quite significantly. Remember that health and well-being figure of 44% for later. That's an important one. I think the fact that a lot of community stuff probably captures all the anti-poverty stuff as much as economic well-being at the moment. I think we've changed what we mean by some of that community development stuff in the last few years. So, this is one of my favourite bits from the last report. So this is where they work. Now, so these are all the council wards in the city. That always struck me. That's Moss Side. That's a huge over-concentration of stuff, which is a legacy of the, oh, we need to put some money into a deprived area of Manchester. You know, says, I remember talking to one company that swanned up from London and wanted to come and work in Moss Side because they'd clearly read the papers 30 years ago. But this is what it looks like now. It's a slightly different scale, but you can see there's some consistency in Charlestown, Bradford, Old Moat and Brooklands all still come out as the least voluntary sector activity going on, but it's balanced out a bit. In fact, it's actually Longsight and Levenshulme are now the most activity going on, which I think would probably fit with what we've seen. There just seems to have been a sudden emergence in the local community of people wanting to be active and do stuff, you know, the levy massive and all that sort of thing.